Massachusetts to raise awareness on the pressing issues that are presented by the climate crisis, driving our statewide and federal government to pass environmental justice legislation and encouraging self-directed climate action. Our previous initiatives include planning multiple strikes in Boston and holding a town hall with 10 of the candidates for the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District. We seek to empower Massachusetts youth to become change makers who are dedicated to enacting climate justice and educated about the climate crisis.
March for Lives Massachusetts is a youth-led gun violence prevention organization working to end gun violence in all its forms across the state. And we have a network of chapters in schools, cities, and towns that all advocate for change in our community and in the state by socio-political awareness, education, political engagement, and direct action. March for Lives Massachusetts works to specifically amplify and emphasize the voices of communities of color who are disproportionately impacted by gun violence and silence in their calls for change. Through legislative advocacy, media campaigns, and collaborations with other youth organizations, we work to target the root causes of gun violence, white supremacy, and socioeconomic justice. Please be sure to check out the March for Lives card. You'll be able to give feedback on your experience today. Join March for Lives Massachusetts, support Black liberation efforts in Massachusetts, and get updated on other ways to get involved in our fight to save lives. That is at mfolma.card.co, and we can put that in the link as well.
We have spent a long time not only planning this event, but also brainstorming and receiving questions that relate to the work we do, as March for Our Lives Massachusetts primarily concerns gun violence prevention, and Boston Climate Strike primarily concerns environmental justice. We've also received numerous questions from youth across Massachusetts on a range of issues, from mental health and Indigenous sovereignty to police brutality and engaging Gen Z in governing.
Tonight's forum will run from now until approximately 8 p.m. with Senator Ed Markey answering questions from 6 to 7 and Congressman Joe Kennedy answering questions from 7 to 8. We will spend the first portion of the hour asking questions prepared by our organizations and members. Then we will ask questions fielded from a forum sent to youth across the state on a variety of topics. Candidates will have 2 minutes to answer each question. We will then ask them a quick series of rapid fire questions before both candidates end their time with a brief closing statement. For each candidate, there are 3 moderators. This hour, we have Nakia Jean Charles from March for Lives Massachusetts, and Iris Liebman and Amelia Kane from Boston Climate Strike.
Hi everyone, my name is Nakia Jean Charles. I'm the March for Our Lives State Director in Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Iris. I am a rising sophomore at Brookline High School, and I'm part of the Boston Climate Strike policy team and Fridays for Future Massachusetts.
Hi everyone, my name is Amelia Kane. I'm a rising sophomore at Newton North High School, and I'm a member of the Boston Climate Strike policy team, and I also co-founded and co-coordinate a youth-led climate education organization. Now we're going to introduce the first candidate to join us. U.S. Senator Ed Markey serves as the chair of the Senate Climate Task Force and on the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Small Business Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee. These key leadership positions earned over 40 years of legislative work, established him as a powerful leader both nationally and internationally on climate and energy policy, most recently as the co-author of the Green New Deal in 2018. While serving for 37 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, Ed Markey fought for his constituents throughout his congressional district before being elected to the Senate in a special election in June 2013. Ed Markey was born in Malden, Massachusetts, and went on to attend Boston College and Boston College Law School. He was elected to the Massachusetts State House, where he served 2 terms representing Malden and Melrose. He is married to Dr. Susan Blumenthal and lives in Malden. Please join me in welcoming U.S. Senator Ed Markey.
So thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this very important forum, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to be having. I marched with all of you for the March for Our Lives back in March of 2018. So I marched for 3 hours with you, with the college and high school and grammar school kids, and it was an amazing experience. And I was out on Boston City Hall Mall when the climate strike took place. So I was there for both of those events, and they were both incredibly well organized. And it's just a symbol that it's young people who are leading on the issues that are most pressing today. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Senator Markey. So first, we're going to get started with a few questions prepared by our organizations, Boston Climate Strike and March for Our Lives, Massachusetts.
Hi. So the first question is going to be from March for Our Lives. The question is: It has become more widely understood that the fight for gun violence prevention and the fight against police brutality are one and the same, because police violence is gun violence. What would you do if elected to transition resources and funding away from police departments and carceral institutions towards community violence intervention programs and other groups that actually contribute to our safety?
Yeah, we have to fund healing and not harming. We have to fund education and not incarceration. This is a question of values, and we have to make sure that we shift over to ensuring that the resources are there in the community that serves as preventative measures because of the investment that you're making in those people who need help the most in our society. And so, yes, with Elizabeth Warren and Congresswoman Presley, we have introduced the legislation to outlaw qualified immunity so that police officers are not immune from a lawsuit by the family if that family's loved one has been murdered by a police officer. We need to do that. We also need to make sure that we have the strictest possible gun laws on the books. But we also have to make sure that we end this school to prison pipeline that we have in our country. 1 in 4 people in the world who are imprisoned in the United States. 25% of all prisoners are in the United States. 1 in 3 women who are imprisoned in the world are imprisoned in the United States. 1 in 3 women in the world here in the United States. And we have more African-American men behind bars right now than the total number of slaves in the United States in 1850. So we have a problem. We have a criminal justice problem. We have to have police reform. We also need the strongest possible gun safety legislation put on the books. And we need to shift over resources over into helping and not harming and making sure we take care of those who are most in need in our society. So thank you for that great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Our next question is from Boston Climate Strike, and we would like to ask, you co-authored the Green New Deal, which is so far only a framework to eventually achieve a just and sustainable future. What are the next steps necessary to turn this from a set of ideals into a reality?
Well, thank you. So Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I introduced the Green New Deal in February of 2019. And it was criticized by Fox News, by Donald Trump, even by Democrats who were saying, well, it goes too far. It's too much. It's too fast. Well, what Alexandria and I said in the Green New Deal is the planet is running a fever. There are no emergency rooms for planets. We have to engage in preventative care. Number 2, that preventative care is making sure that we get the same kind of treatment that the oil, gas, and coal industry got for 100 years and is still receiving today. They get tax breaks today. That looks like socialism to me. They criticize the Green New Deal as being socialistic. Well, give us those tax breaks for wind and solar, all electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, for storage battery technologies, for energy conservation strategies. We will bury the fossil fuel industry in a generation. That is the goal, which Alexandria and I had. And we also built in the provision that we have to just state it very clearly that black and brown families in the United States have always breathed dirtier air, higher levels of asthma, more vulnerability to coronavirus. And we have to be very intentional. That's what the Green New Deal says, that we ensure that people of color, that indigenous people, that all those who have always been left out are at the front of the room. They're in on they're on the agenda to make sure that the frontline communities go to the front of the line and they get protected. So I believe that the Green New Deal has changed the way in which America now thinks about the climate crisis. And now every presidential candidate has a climate plan. It's driven by young people. It's driven by the energy of young people on this call and all across the country. And my feeling is that when Joe Biden is sworn in as president of the United States and we control the House and the Senate, that front and center as we begin next year, there will be a Green New Deal. And it's going to be so much bolder than anyone ever thought they would be supporting just a year and a half ago. And you know what's helping us? Trump doesn't believe in the science of coronavirus, and he doesn't believe in the science of climate change. And all of that is being discredited. And we're going to have a referendum this November as we fumigate the White House and the Senate Republican control of our agenda.
Senator, you're muted.
Apologize. I just get energized about the Green New Deal. Sorry.
Awesome, thank you. This is another question from March for Our Lives. Massachusetts has led the fight for lowering the voting age to 16 for municipal elections in Massachusetts. With the Vote 16 MA campaign, do you support lowering the voting age to 16, and what would you do if elected to make that a reality?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, the issues of today, climate change, net neutrality, gun safety, racial justice, those are issues which young people are leading on. And that's why I support lowering the voting age in Massachusetts municipal elections to 16. We need in Massachusetts to be the leader. We need in our communities to have young people who are showing up and participating in this process. Ultimately, government is a stimulus response institution, and there's nothing more stimulating in Massachusetts than having hundreds of thousands of young people all of a sudden showing up to vote. That will get the response which we need on all of these big issues. And since you are the leaders, you should be, and most affected by it, I might add, most affected by the fact that these issues aren't dealt with, you should have the right to be able to vote and to change the system.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question is from Boston Climate Strike. So the Red Deal is a platform that calls for actions even beyond the Green New Deal and focuses on divesting away from the police, prisons, military, and fossil fuel companies and investing in, among other things, free healthcare, housing, and education, a transition to an economy that benefits everyone, and the restoration of indigenous lands. It is grounded on 4 principles: that what creates the crisis cannot solve it, that change comes from below and to the left, that politicians can't do what only mass movements do, and that we should transition from theory into action. Do you support this? And if so, how will you fight for indigenous rights and the other principles of the Red New Deal and include them in legislation?
Yeah, well, it was indigenous people who led the fight against the Dakota pipeline. They're the ones that led the fight. They're the ones that rallied the whole country. And again, as I said a couple of minutes ago, we wrote it into the Green New Deal. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I, we wrote in that we need to ensure that indigenous people are at the table, that they're getting the kind of respect and protections which they deserve. And so from my perspective, this is an issue of justice. Keystone Pipeline, Dakota Pipeline, the expropriation of Native American lands, all of this has to end, which is why I support so strongly the efforts to overturn the Trump administration efforts to take the Wampanoag land and strip them of their historic rights. So it's time for us. It's why I signed on to an amicus brief going to the courts so that we would stand up with indigenous people in Massachusetts, but we have to do the same thing across our entire nation. This is a matter of justice. And again, we built it in front and center into the Green New Deal. We wrote it in. Indigenous people must now be given the respect and the protections which they need that they have historically been denied. It was called radical, it was called socialist a year and a half ago, but you want to know what? All across the country, millions of people are now standing up and calling for justice. And a big part of it is to make sure that Indigenous people get that justice. So thank you for that great question.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is, suicides make up 2/3 of gun violence deaths in the United States, yet are ignored in the discussion of gun violence prevention. With young people struggling to access adequate mental health resources and COVID-19 leaving more people feeling isolated and alone, what would you do to prevent the tragedies like this from occurring without stigmatizing mental health in the process?
And that's a great question. You know, I had my first date with my wife 36 years ago, and she was the chief of behavioral medicine at the National Institutes of Health. She's a psychiatrist, my wife. And what we talked about was the stigma of substance abuse and mental health, and how we had to change it, and how we had to treat these things as diseases that were no different than physical diseases. And so from my perspective, you know, my wife ultimately wound up as the Assistant Surgeon General of the United States, and she was a 2-star admiral in the public health service. So that's where I met her. She was a public health service doctor, my wife. And she was actually in charge of teenage suicide and depression in the United States. And so it's absolutely critical that we provide funding at the highest possible levels for all mental health needs in our country. It should be a fundamental right. It should be absolutely guaranteed as full equality with the physical illnesses, and it just goes to a question of ensuring that, and under Medicare for All, which I support, and I was standing next to Bernie Sanders when he introduced it. We just have to make sure that this is a healthcare right for every single person in the United States, so that they get the help which they need. And by the way, I was able to add $25 million to the budget in December. For the first time, the Centers for Disease Control can do the definitive study on the causes of gun violence in American society. The NRA had blocked it for an entire generation. I beat the NRA in December to make sure that that funding would be there.
Thank you. And this is the last question from our organization. So from BCS, as a senator in Massachusetts, you're likely aware of the construction of the Weymouth compressor station in a working class community. How have you and how will you continue to collaborate with youth, especially Black, Indigenous youth of color, in order to ensure environmental injustices are combated in our state, such as the Weymouth compressor station?
You know, thank you so much. So I have been down there at the Weymouth compressor station, standing shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to shoulder with the residents of Weymouth and Braintree and Quincy. That little plot of land is not a place where compressor stations should be built. And it should definitely not be a place where a multinational corporation is able to build a pipeline like a straw right through Massachusetts, so they can take that natural gas up to Maine or up to Canada and then export it. So all of the risks are taken by the people in Massachusetts. And so I have stood with and fought to make sure that that compressor station is not built, is not completed. And I've gone even further. I've introduced legislation into the United States Senate saying that no compressor station should ever be built anywhere if the net result is exporting the natural gas out of our country. What's the point of us running the environmental risks and a multinational corporation getting all of the profits from it? So it's absolutely a disgrace what has happened. I've stood with them down there, and I continue to be their advocate, their partner in the efforts. And that's why, for the most part, they are backing me in this Senate race, because they know that I've been there and fought for them and with them right from the beginning.
Thank you. The next questions will be from the community and people from Massachusetts. The first question is from Mateen from Brookline. The LGBTQ plus people, especially in the Black trans women community, facing ongoing violence and persecution for living openly. How will you protect these communities and help them receive the rights and safety they deserve without relying on institutions like the police, who are at times the cause of the violence and persecutions they face?
Well, transgender rights are human rights. And it is absolutely imperative to remember that even going back to Stonewall in 1969, that the Black trans community was there leading the effort. So that's why I introduced legislation into the United States Senate to ensure that it's called the gay trans panic defense, meaning that somebody says, oh, I met someone, they were trans, and I panicked and I beat them up or I killed them. And that's my defense. I panicked. So what I did last year was introduce legislation to ban the gay trans panic defense, because it's just an excuse. It's an excuse to allow for people to do things which should be punishable by, if they kill them, by imprisonment. If they harm them in any way, they have to suffer the full penalties of the law. So from my perspective, this is absolutely essential. And I give you my pledge that I am going to get that law passed. I'm going to ban the gay trans panic defense from remaining a part of American jurisprudence, in the same way that we're going to have to get rid of qualified immunity that police officers use when they have murdered an innocent person.
Thank you. The next question is from Valentina from Great Barrington and Oswaldo from Cambridge. You and Representative Kennedy are both regarded as very progressive legislators in Washington. How do your positions and beliefs currently differ, and what will be different from your previous terms in office if you're reelected this year?
Well, what I've done in my career is this. I took on the oil and the gas industry and the auto industry, and it's my law that ensured that the fuel economy standards went to 54.5 miles per gallon, still the single largest reduction in greenhouse gases of any law passed in any country in the world. That's my law. I led and I delivered. On the issue of gun safety, it's my law, the $25 million that will now have the research done at the Centers for Disease Control. It's my law that keeps out millions of Chinese semi-automatic assault weapons out of our country at $90 a piece. That's my law. My law makes NRA stand for not relevant anymore in American politics. That's on the books. It's my law which mandates that we find the cure for Alzheimer's by the year 2025. It's going to wind up being a $25 to $30 billion research program. 5 million baby boomers have it. Alzheimer's right now. 15 million baby boomers will have Alzheimer's if we don't find the cure. I led, I delivered. That's my law. When Wall Street was ripping people off, I passed the insider trading law to rein in those bad guys. That's my law. On issue after issue, opioids, healthcare, and making sure that the huge telephone and cable companies were broken up so that we could have broadband. Not one person in America had broadband when my laws passed, but I also made sure that every child got the internet on their desk. That's a $54 billion program to make sure that kids in Roxbury and Chelsea and Lawrence have the internet on their desk. That's my law. I broke up the monopolies and made sure that the poorest kids had access to the internet so they could compete equally with kids from the suburbs. That's my law. So I've led and I've delivered on these laws. I have more than 500 laws that are on the books, and each time I found a way to legislate in order to advance the goals of the people of Massachusetts and our country.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question is from CJ from Brockton, who says, I've learned more about Black and LGBT history on social media platforms such as TikTok, more than I have in any school classroom. Our history classes are being whitewashed. 99% of the events in both Black and LGBT history seem to not exist. Black and LGBT people exist outside of February, Black History Month, and June, Pride Month, which is when history teachers, in my experience, focus on these subjects. Would you ever consider passing a law that requires public schools to teach Black and LGBT history throughout the entire year?
Yes, I agree with that 100%. 100%. There's a hidden history in our country. Obviously, that's why Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, and I have introduced a reparations bill so we can begin this whole discussion of the real Black history in the United States. The LGBTQ community as well needs to have that education taught in our schools so that everyone is given the history and the respect which they need. When I was starting law school, there were no women, no African Americans in the class the year before me. And all of a sudden, women and African Americans, they were exploding in anger on the streets of the United States. So all of a sudden, 10% of the class was women and 10% were Black. And one of the sons of a lawyer who was in the class after 3 weeks asked our professor, who had been a constitutional law professor at Howard University and had been the second lawyer on Brown versus Board of Education, Muhammad Ali's lawyer. The young law student who was white, he kept, my father was a milkman. I'm in my living room here in Malden. My father was a milkman for the Hood Milk Company. So I didn't know enough, early on to know what the right questions were. What's the definition of standing, he said. And the professor finally looked at him and said, young man, you're white. You were born with standing. A white man is born with standing in the United States. Your job is to get standing for everyone who's not a white man for the rest of your life as a lawyer. That's going to be the agenda of the United States. That's why we need to teach Black and LGBTQ history in our schools so that everyone understands our own history and that we own it, because only by owning it can we change the policies, the racial and other biases that are just built into the economic, criminal justice, healthcare, educational, and environmental structures of our country. You have to teach the history, so then you can move to activation, then you can move to implementation. But we need to make sure every young person gets the right education. And that's why, again, it's so important for you to be able to vote in Massachusetts elections at the municipal level to make sure it gets built into our curriculum.
Thank you. The next person is Devesh from Lexington. Senator Markey, you voted for the 1994 crime bill, which was responsible for disproportionately criminalizing Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of colors in the Black community. That accelerated mass incarceration while increasing the length of prison sentences and reducing the potential for early releases. What have you done and will do to undo the harm that you have caused to the Black community?
Well, every member of the Massachusetts delegation, including Senator Kennedy, voted for that bill. And the reason that people voted for it at the time was that it included a ban on assault weapons. It included, for the first time, the Violence Against Women's Act was built in. But it's clear that the sentencing guidelines in that legislation were wrong. And we owe an apology to an entire generation of African-American young men who were incarcerated as a result. That's why Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and I have introduced something, Cory is the lead, called the Next Step Act. And the Next Step Act, the goal of that is to ensure that we just change what the laws are in the country right now, to do away with 3 strikes and you're out, to change the sentencing guidelines between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine. Powdered cocaine is like a white suburban cocaine. Crack cocaine is more inner city, and it's 18 times higher in its punishment of crack cocaine. And so that just has to be eliminated. That discrepancy has to be eliminated. We have to give back voting rights. We have to ensure that we expunge the records of low-level drug offenders. we have to make sure that we deal realistically with the fact that 1 in 4 people in the world who are in prison in the United States, and they're disproportionately people of color. We have to just say we're changing that we are going to make sure that we guarantee that we provide real justice for each one of those individuals, but in the future that we no longer tolerate the kind of injustice that is built into our criminal justice system. So for me, it's at the top of the list. And that's why I'm partnering with Cory Booker in our legislation, and why Cory Booker, and by the way, also, Rachel Rollins is the district attorney in Boston, and she's endorsing me in this race, as is Cory Booker, because they know of my commitment to ensuring that we absolutely have a criminal justice reform. And that's in addition to Nika Allegato and Liz Miranda and other great leaders in the city of Boston who fundamentally want to see this kind of change, and they are backing me in this race.
Thank you. Going along with this topic, what is your view on expanding voting rights to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people and protecting those living in prisons and detention centers from the spread of COVID-19? How do you plan to bring this to a Senate in a way that other senators have not?
Well, can you read that first part of the question again?
Yes, sorry. What is your view on expanding voting rights to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to restore voting rights. I was over at the jail in Suffolk County last week with Sheriff Tompkins and actually meeting with prisoners, many of whom could vote. And we have to make sure that people can vote and do vote so that they can protect their interests. And again, on a national level, we just have to make sure that we restore voting rights to prisoners. It's just too many people, millions, that are just excluded from the voting rolls. And on the question of COVID, yeah, we have to provide the resources to all of the prisons, all of the jails in Massachusetts, but all across the country. We don't want there to be unnecessary illness or death that occurs because of a lack of funding that is being provided to these incarceration institutions in our country. Moreover, I introduced legislation that says, number one, that no one should lose their health care insurance, Medicaid coverage, if they can't post bail. If you can post bail, you keep your health care insurance, Medicaid. If you can't, you lose it. And if you're in prison, you lose your Medicaid coverage while you're in prison. Nationally, makes no sense whatsoever. So my legislation would guarantee that anyone who was in prison had the coverage stick with them. And then when you leave prison, you should automatically keep it and have it be reinstated. And why is that? Because you're 140 times more likely to overdose in the first 2 weeks after you leave prison because you don't have any healthcare insurance than another individual in our society. So those are my bills, which I have been pressing, and I've actually found on a couple of them a Republican in the Senate, and I'm hopeful that ultimately we'll be able to pass those laws and to provide the healthcare coverage that people need, whether it's COVID or any other disease that is afflicting someone who is in prison. And by the way, 70 to 80% of them have mental health or substance abuse issues. So we have to provide them with the healthcare they need. That's what my wife taught me on my first date. That's her specialty. It's addiction and mental health. And if we don't provide the help for them, the services for them, then there's going to be just a continuation, a repetition of what we've seen in the past. Healthcare, it's what we talked about in the first question. Healthcare. We need to heal people. We need to make sure we give them the resources which they need.
Thank you. The next question is from Lily from Newton. The Supreme Court ruled this week that employees can deny their employees' insurance coverage of birth control. Inaccessibility disproportionately affects lower income communities and people and menstruators and people of color. What will you do if elected to make sure that the birth control and contraceptives are accessible for all?
Well, number one, we have to reinstate Title 10 of Planned Parenthood, so that the funding is at Planned Parenthood, and that women who need access to medical services get them. I'm actually an original co-sponsor of the Women's Health Protection Act, which is a critical federal safeguard against the erosion of abortion access for women in our country. And I'm an original co-sponsor of that. And I'm also a big supporter of Massachusetts legislature passing the Roe Act, so that we lead in Massachusetts. We put it right on the books here, and I would urge all of you here to be pressing, to see that the Roe Act does get enacted in the state of Massachusetts. It's absolutely imperative, and we have an opportunity to codify abortion rights and contraception as just a part of our culture. And that's why, by the way, Planned Parenthood has endorsed me in this Senate race. They've endorsed me. And NARAL has endorsed me in this race because they know of my complete commitment on these issues. And by the way, my wife was named by President Clinton the head of all women's health in the United States. So she ran all women's health in the United States as Assistant Surgeon General. And she's led the effort to just make sure that there was equality in the access to healthcare that women receive, women of all colors receive in our country. And I'm very proud of her work. And I try my best to honor that on the floor of the United States Senate every day that I am there.
Thank you, Senator Markey. The next question is from Charlie from Pittsfield. Charlie says, many rural communities, especially in Western Mass, often feel forgotten and left out of some of the conversations going on in the eastern part of the state. Many schools lack funding, some communities have terrible internet access, and most are less accessible to opportunities offered in the urban areas of the state. How, if elected, will you work to represent these rural communities and fight for issues particular to them?
No, thank you so much. That's a great question. Yeah, people don't really think of Western Mass in the Berkshires when you think of rural America, but they are in many instances. And so that's why, for example, in this coronavirus crisis, believe it or not, here's the number: 12 million young people do not have access to the internet at home. 12 million. And we know who they are. They're predominantly Black and brown and poor and rural. We know who they are. And as these young people are at home, there's going to be a homework gap that's going to lead to a learning gap that's going to lead to an opportunity gap for them. They're just going to fall further behind, which is why in the next 2 weeks on the Senate floor, I'm going to be fighting for $4 billion in order to make sure that they get it at home for free, so that they're able to participate in this educational system that could, for the foreseeable future, be disrupted, so that there isn't full-time attendance in the classroom. And that's a program I built on my original program, which I wrote, which is a $54 billion educational technology program that does provide the internet to the desk of everyone in our country, whether it's rural or it's urban, that they get it. And it's a way of making sure that a technology that we know is out in the suburbs is put in the hands of poorer kids and more rural kids as well. And on top of that, we also have to guarantee that we have a huge broadband build out in our country, which is why I am proposing when we have a huge infrastructure bill, and we will, that we put tens of billions of dollars in to make sure that in the inner city and in rural America, that everyone has access to broadband. Broadband is now like water or air or electricity. You have to have it in order to be competitive, in order to be able to maximize your God-given abilities. And so I am fighting for that as a part of the infrastructure bill to make sure that it gets built out into every single city and town, no matter how rural or how inner city it may be, so that they have access to what they need in order to be successful.
Thank you. The next question is Isabella from Summers. Funding for schools is provided by property taxes.
I said, what did you say? I'm sorry.
Oh, the next.
Yeah,
were
could
you
you just
asking
start
a
again?
question?
I'm sorry. If you could just
Oh
start
yeah,
again.
definitely. Funding for schools is provided by property taxes in a town and federal funding based on how these schools perform on standardized tests. However, schools in low-income communities may not receive a lot of funding from property taxes and may not score well on standardized tests due to a lack of resources, meaning these communities have to fall behind. Do you support getting rid of standardized testing so schools don't rely on this form of federal funding? How do you propose that we make sure all schools can get this form of funding and ensure that all students do well, regardless of the economic status of the communities they live in?
No, thank you. That is the core question that we have to deal with. I'm here in Malden right now. I'm living in the house that I grew up with my father, who was a milkman for the Hood Milk Company. And I live in the same house on the same street. Malden High School last year. Here's the graduating class: 25% Black, 25% white, 25% Latino, 25% Asian. It's the most diverse high school in the United States of America, right here in Malden. And we're not a rich community at all, which is why it was so important for the state legislature to pass the bill that is providing tens of millions of additional dollars for Malden. And the same thing is true for Brockton and Lawrence and Chelsea and Springfield and Boston, because you have to equalize the funding level to make sure that every child gets access to the quality education which they need. And so nothing is more important to me than making sure that that is the case, because I can see the kids now on the street are Haitian, they're Asian, they're Salvadoran, the Irish, the Italian, the Jewish kids have moved on as they grew up. And hopefully the same thing is going to happen here, but it won't if they don't get access to the quality education which they deserve. And a vision without funding is an hallucination. If you don't fund, then don't expect to get the different results which you expect. And so even on the standardized testing, we have to take a step back. I called for a suspension of the MCAS tests during the coronavirus, but I think it's also imperative that we step back and we just look at the cultural biases that are built into testing that don't reflect the upbringing, the backgrounds of so many children in our country. And I think this gives us an opportunity right now to do that complete and total reevaluation.
Thank you. An anonymous submission says, what have you done and what will you do to advocate for the disabled community while in the Senate, especially in a time like the present, specifically around healthcare costs, employment, and accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that we have to guarantee that we fight for the disabled community. So one of the things I was able to do when I was running the Telecommunications Committee in the House of Representatives, so I made sure that every wireless device is 100% accessible to the deaf and blind community in the United States. The Electronics Association of America, they didn't want to do it. But if you don't have a device that is totally accessible and you're deaf or you're blind, then you are left behind, because the 21st century is all about the internet. It is all about ensuring that everyone has access to it. And with regard to this broader set of disabilities issues, it is absolutely imperative that we put on at the front of the line the funding that breaks down every single remaining barrier for anyone with any disability whatsoever. In 2017, there was a young woman, Revka Solomon, who came to me. She told me that she had an illness, MECFS, and there are many, many people with that. 2.5 million people have that disease in the United States. So I have introduced the legislation to ensure that there's full funding for the research, and I'm doing that on a bipartisan basis with other Republican senators in order to put that issue front and center and to make sure that it does not get left behind. And my goal is to have it included in the next coronavirus package so that we not allow for that discrimination to continue. And I learned it in a town meeting when this woman just moved to the microphone and told her story. And so I am acting on that right now, and I'm hopeful that I will be successful in the coronavirus relief package to build in the funding for that program. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Our last audience question is from Samantha from Brookline. But before I say the question, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions, and we're sorry if we didn't get to yours. We received a lot of submissions, and we really appreciate how civically engaged this generation was when putting together the questions, when submitting questions. So this question is from Samantha from Brookline, and the question is, what is your view on reopening schools in Massachusetts, specifically high schools? How would you use your influence and position to guide schools and young students through this time?
Thank you very much. Yeah, see, I don't think it's a question of a date. It's a question of data. Do we have the data to ensure that we can do this safely so that young people are not exposed, so that educators are not exposed, that other school personnel are exposed? So when you listen to Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, and by the way, she is in the running as the worst cabinet secretary. It's a difficult competition, but I think Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, is right there as the winner of the worst Secretary of Education, but the worst cabinet member in the Trump administration. And we know how low that has to be in order to qualify. But that's where I put her. So here's what they're doing right now. They're saying, on the one hand, every kid should go back to school. Now, we don't have the personal protective equipment. We don't have enough testing. We don't have enough funding for the schools. I'm going to be fighting in one of the biggest battles of my whole career on the floor of the Senate over the next 2 weeks to get $175 billion for K through 12 in our country, so the teachers don't get laid off, so that the PPE is there, the testing is there, the resources are there. And guess who's opposing it? The Trump administration, who says we should open the schools. Well, you're basically creating the conditions for a disaster in our country. And they're going to open the schools, we'll wait about a month, and then everything will shut down again because they have not been wise. So my opinion is this: we have to first have this debate over whether or not we're going to fund it. And then we're going to leave it to the healthcare professionals and the educators to determine whether or not it is safe for young people to go back into their classrooms. It should not be a political decision at all. It has to be completely guided by the science. And step one is to make sure the resources are there. And that's what I'm going to be fighting for on the floor of the Senate over the next 2 weeks in one of the most epic battles that I've ever been a part of.
Thank you, Senator Markey, for responding. Oh, thank you. Before we move on to your closing statement, we're going to do a few rapid fire questions. These should be a yes, no, or one word / phrase answer. The first one of the rapid fire questions is from Eric from Staunton, who asks, will you commit to a major reduction in military spending to reinvest those funds in fighting climate change?
Yes, I have a bill to cut the nuclear weapons budget by $100 billion. And if we spent that on clean energy technologies, we'd be on the fast track to solve that problem while not making the world more dangerous with more nuclear weapons. We don't need another nuclear weapon.
Thank you. The next question is from Solomon from Worcester. Says, Rep. Ayanna Pressley has joined the movement for Black Lives to introduce the Breathe Act, a bill that divests from policing and invests in a new vision of public safety. Would you work with her and the movement for Black Lives to introduce this bill to Senate?
Well, I want to read that legislation, but I do support the intent. The intent is to make sure that we put more resources into education, into healthcare, into prevention, into job training, and I support that 100%.
Thank you. And our next rapid fire is international college students have been under attack from the Trump administration and ICE, who just threatened to terminate their visas if their college or university offers exclusively online instruction in the fall. Well, the decision was just reversed. ICE has continuously traumatized and over-policed immigrant and undocumented communities. Do you support the abolition of ICE?
Um, I think that we have to overhaul ICE. We have to overhaul its mission. There's no two ways about it. We have a racist president who has been criminally negligent in discharge of his duties, and one of his goals is to completely say he's going to make America great again by making America hate again, and that's demonizing minorities, Mexicans, Muslims, and immigrants, and that's why we're going to have to fight for them. Without question, 100%. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey. As our final question, please tell us either your favorite joke or tell us a quick embarrassing story.
My favorite joke or my most embarrassing story. Wow, that's a tough choice. My most embarrassing story. Well, you know, I will tell you, I'm in law school. I've never gone to law school, but I have a vocabulary that I've learned, but I've just never used many of the words. So I'm in my first year of law school, and all these kids are there, and I'm a commuter from Malden. Most of them are living over in Cleveland Circle at Boston College Law School, and so he said, "So where would you think that we were in this case right now, Mr. Markey?" As I'm standing with the other 80 people around me, and I said, "Well, I think right now we're at the apogee of this case." And he said, "Do you mean apogee, Mr. Markey?" And I said, "Honestly, I know how to spell it. I know what it means. I've just never used it in public before. I'm from Malden." And 79 other people just laughed at me for about 5 minutes. What an idiot you are, Markey. You don't even know how to, you just use the word, you don't even know how to pronounce it. And my face was red for, honestly, it's like maybe an hour. I was so humiliated. The sweat went down my armpit. The sweat was coming off my baby fingers. And I realized I had a lot of work to do if I was ever going to be a lawyer. But at the same time, I said, I do know what it means, and I do know how to spell it, and I do know how to use it in a sentence. I just don't know these words. And that was I will say this, it was part of my growing up, you know, because you're going to be put in situations where you just don't know, especially if your father's a milkman. But I also know, and I'll finish up with this, that I was white, and I wasn't black or brown. And black and brown people have much greater obstacles than I ever had. As much as I could say that was an embarrassing situation for me, that I know that it's even more difficult for people of color. And that's why I fight so hard to provide equal rights and opportunities and break down discriminatory barriers. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Markey, for responding to our questions. I think that last one made us all laugh a little bit. You now have 3 minutes to give a closing statement to youth across Massachusetts, many of whom will be voting this September.
So thank you so much. And thank you all for being the leaders which our state and our country needs. On the Green New Deal, I partnered with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I introduced it to change the whole dynamic, the entire way in which our country, and in fact the world, talks about climate crisis. And it has created an intergenerational compact between young people and old people that has now elevated this issue to the absolute top of the political priorities in our country. And I pledge to you that I will continue to partner with you on those issues. The Sunrise Movement has endorsed me in this race because they know I am the leader on the issue. On net neutrality, I am the leader in the United States Senate on the issue of net neutrality to make sure that we break down the discriminatory policies that cable and telephone companies want to impose upon young people and old, entrepreneurs and people whose voices for democracy want to be heard. I am the leader on net neutrality. The same thing is true on gun violence. It's my law that beat the NRA just in December, so that for the first time, there is gun research being done on the causes of violence in our country. Why are we the most violent country? Why are we the ones that have the highest levels? Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's have the CDC do the study. The NRA did not want that money to go in, but I beat the NRA. And on the issues of racial justice, I am 100% committed to breaking down all of these discriminatory barriers in every single part of our society. The buildings in our country may be smoldering, but the soul of our country is on fire. And we have to respond with the changes in police reform, in criminal justice reform, environmental justice, educational opportunity for everyone, healthcare provided for everyone in our society. That is who I have been. America is going through a funny period where a nostalgia for a time that never existed is replacing the idealism that we need to solve the huge problems of today. But for the poor, the sick, the elderly, minorities, people of color, LGBTQ community, the disabled community, the past is just a memory, and the future is their hard reality. All I can promise you is that I have given it everything that I have throughout my whole career, and I will continue to do so. And if you have my back in this election, I will have your back on the floor of the Senate for the next 6 years. Thank you for the great opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for joining us and answering our questions, Senator Markey. We really appreciate that you took the time to talk to us. Yeah, thank you so much. So now we're going to try to take a minute. Now we're going to take a minute and switch candidates and moderators.